Egress. Regress.
Okay, is it changing now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll just go back and show you the pictures and stuff. I had some pictures of waterlogged gardens in here, and you can see how high the water is on that top picture. And the bottom picture isn't as good of quality, but you can kind of see the debris and stuff around the rows. And then this is where we were at. I was talking about the wilting and the corn plants and how you can see they're just wilted and the growth is stunted, and the water accumulation can trigger root diseases. And then this was the picture I was talking about with the shoot growth, how you can see the shoots were normal size, they look fine on day 1 or day 0, and then after 14 days of waterlogging, only 2 weeks, they're half the size and have less than half the roots. So that's one of the most visible effects of waterlogging. And then consider having your soil tested. You won't be able to test for biological contaminants, but you may be able to test for chemical contaminants. I know a lot of conventional agricultural labs don't really test for all chemical contaminants, but it is possible. And it'll also show you like your phosphorus, your nitrogen, your zinc, all of that stuff. So you'll be able to manage that after having it tested. Allow the ground to dry out. You don't want to be adding stuff into it while it's still waterlogged and wet. And thoroughly till the soil as deeply as possible to incorporate oxygen back in. You want to remove the water and incorporate the oxygen back into the pores. Incorporate good organic matter to bind metals and dilute contaminants. Soil microbes can eat toxic compounds and harmful bacteria. So if you're incorporating your compost and all that stuff after you have it tested and you allow the ground to dry out, that's going to reduce the amount of contaminants in the soil. And then consider a cover crop as your first planting rather than produce crops. Buckwheat, crimson clover. I even saw like trees to reclaim the soil too. I saw poplar, I think, was an option that some people use. So there's a lot of different things, different plants you can use to remediate soil. Oh, I forget, I have to change it on this one because I'm looking at my computer. Some possible sources of contamination that come from floodwater: sewage, farm runoff, and that would include like manure, fertilizer, chemicals, pesticides, and then industrial runoff, which would mostly just be like chemicals. I'm sure we've all seen like a picture like this before in like elementary school, but it's a really good visual way of seeing how and where runoff comes from. You've got the precipitation coming down and all the runoff from cities and buildings, and you got a factory over there, and then houses, the runoff from the garden, from the animals in the barn, all into that stream. But in this case, it's floodwater that's coming in everywhere. And then just another one, you can see the runoff from the house, from the plants in the road going into the drain, and then when it floods, all of that is just up and everywhere. So you're getting contaminants from a lot of different places when you're in floodwater. And when you're dealing with floodwater, you really want to think about cross-contamination. Hands, clothing, footwear that is worn in floodwater contaminated areas should not be worn in areas that have not been contaminated. I know this is hard when you're out working in the field and you're wearing your clothes and you're doing whatever. But if you're tracking from the floodwater areas to areas that aren't contaminated, you're risking spreading those pathogens from an area where they are to another area where they aren't. Tools used in floodwater contaminated areas should not be used in areas that have not been contaminated. Again, this is not always practical or easy when you're out in the field, cleaning this stuff up, but it's important to try to sanitize or clean these things in between areas you're going through. If you're going to areas that are both contaminated, then it doesn't matter. But if you go into like a flooded area of your garden to a non-flooded area, then that's when it would be important. To minimize cross-contamination, you'll want to throw debris in the trash. You shouldn't compost anything that has been affected by floodwater at all. Even if you think it might not have, it's best to be on the safe side and just throw it out. Wash your hands frequently, clean and sanitize tools frequently, mulching paths and walkways between areas to suppress the contaminants, and remove any clothes and shoes before entering non-contaminated areas. Some pathogens that you could possibly come into contact with when dealing with floodwater: E. coli, salmonella, norovirus, hepatitis A, and giardia, and those are all going to cause gastrointestinal illness or food poisoning. So you want to minimize the risk of those as much as possible when working in floodwater, and especially in your garden. So to minimize the risk of human pathogens being spread, there should be a waiting period between when floodwaters recede and when produce is harvested. Exposure to solar energy from the sun can help reduce the pathogens, but some pathogens can persist in soil for several years. So time is really the best thing, as much time as you can give your space before you start planting again, just to be sure those things aren't coming up into your plants. Any edible portion that matures before the end of the waiting period should be discarded. So I know for a lot of people right now, especially since it's we're getting into the fall gardening season, most things are going to have to be disposed of. For crops that don't come into direct contact with soil, so that would be like tomatoes or peppers, or like your beans growing up on your trellis or anything like that, that would be 90 days. So you would want to wait 90 days after the floodwater recedes to harvest anything from that. Anything that matures before then should be thrown away. And then crops that don't have direct contact with the soil, or do have direct contact with the soil, it'll be 120 days. So like potatoes, carrots, anything underground. You don't want to harvest any of that before 120 days. When it comes to salvaging produce, you have to meet 3 criteria. The plants were not in an area of the garden that was covered in floodwater. The edible parts of the plants will ripen or mature after the waiting period that I just talked about, or no parts were touched by splashing water. And if you can't verify these 3 criteria as fact, or if you have any uncertainty about it at all, it's best to just discard the produce. It's not worth the risk of food poisoning. And this is just a quote from the FDA. The likelihood of contamination may be low if the edible portion of the crop developed after the floodwater receded, or the lowest edible portion of the crop was above the floodwater level with minimum risk of contamination due to splashing. And it's just pretty much the same thing that I just went over in those bullet points. And the crop can be harvested without cross-contamination from nearby flooded soil or the flooded portion of the crop. So basically, don't harvest anything from flooded areas. For produce that has come into contact with floodwater, you need to remove and discard anything with visible fruit, any kind of edible buds like cauliflower or broccoli, any underground crops, carrots or potatoes. Those especially, they may look like they're fine, but they're so exposed to that floodwater underground, so it's best to just dispose of those as well. And anything that's generally consumed raw, like leafy greens, there's no way to clean that stuff because there's so many just crevices and ridges that floodwater can get into. So it's best to just discard all of that. There's no method that can safely reduce or remove the hazard of floodwater on produce. So when in doubt, just throw it out. Cleaning and preparing salvage produce. All salvage produce must be cooked to reduce possible pathogen contamination. So anything you harvest, you won't be able to consume it raw. You have to cook it. You can can it, but you can't dehydrate it. The low temperature of home dehydrators, it won't kill the high numbers of bacteria that could possibly be there. And another thing to note, cooking only removes biological contaminants. So that's like the pathogens. It's not going to remove the chemical contaminants that could have possibly been in contact with the floodwater. So, but hopefully if you're harvesting right and not harvesting from areas that were affected, then you won't have to worry about that. But for cleaning, this says 1 tablespoon. I researched between several different extension sources, and some of them said 1 tablespoon of bleach, some of them said 2. So I would veer on the safe side and say 2. But 2 tablespoons of liquid chlorine bleach, and that'll be 5.35% sodium hypochlorite per 1 gallon of water, and that's a concentration of 200 parts per million. You'll want to rinse the produce well with clear tap water, and then submerge your produce and soak it in that bleach solution for 2 minutes. And then you'll want to rinse the produce completely and peel and cook thoroughly before eating. It's important to peel that outer skin off before cooking. And then planting for the next season. Wait at least 100 days after the floodwater recedes to plant edible root crops, and then at least 60 days after floodwater recedes to plant any other edible crops. Try to maintain a neutral soil pH to reduce heavy metal availability. There's some research that says heavy metals like lead and those kinds of things won't be accessible to plants if you keep your soil at a neutral pH. And consider utilizing raised beds or soil containers filled with healthy soil if you're still concerned about soil contamination. But the waiting period is pretty generally safe. If you wait that long to plant, then your soil should be okay as long as you're getting it tested and making sure that it's able to produce viable things. So, and that's my last slide. So does anyone have any questions or anything you want clarification about? I know it's a lot of numbers and words and things, so anything at all?
How do you dispose of?
Well, I tried to find some specific information about how they recommend disposing of. I think just throwing it away and kind of keeping it isolated, like you're only using the trash bag or whatever you're using to put the materials in just for that.
So then throw it in the landfill?
Well, that's not necessarily a great option either, because then those biomaterials are still just sitting in that landfill. I would think maybe burning would be probably the best option for destroying it completely instead of just throwing it somewhere else for it to continue to infect everything. So I would recommend burning, because I know that's recommended for removing like disease things for gardens. So
Oh, that's the basic thing. Even with peonies, you clean up your peonies in the fall, and that's one that specifically says, take everything out. Do not put it in your compost. Burn it. Burn it or bury it.
Yeah. Nothing should be used in compost. I did see something. If you are going to compost anything, don't use it on anything you're going to eat. Use it on your non-edible things like flowers or anything like that, but don't use it for like edible crops. But as for disposing, I would say burning would be the best thing.
I've never seen the days, the 90 days, 120 days. That's really helpful.
Yeah, there are several different sources I was looking through, and so they all kind of vary around, like, I think it was like 2 to 3 months for like letting the soil rest and whatever. Everything's about the same. There's some variation between states, but everything is about this. I tried to make it as central of everything as possible.
But now it's too late to do a lot of stuff.
Well, I was thinking about 120 days. You said I can see like winter squash. Because you're not gonna eat that for, that, you know, that would sit for 120 days. So you might be okay with something like that.
Yeah. Yes, especially since we're so late in the season now.
Mhm.
I was trying to find some helpful information for the late season, but since we're so late, it's really, you're just pretty much gonna have to wait until spring to start anything up. Really not a whole lot of opportunity for fall gardening, because like it says, you have to wait so long before you start planting again, just to allow all those contaminants to kind of go away. So
Your only option would be a raised bed
Yeah.
if you were planting something at this point.
yeah, a raised bed or a container, or if you had an area that wasn't affected by flooding, then you could plant there.
A
But
different area.
yeah, yeah. Anything else?
Trying to think of how you burn produce and things. Do you have to let it dry out first or put an accelerant on it or what?
I'd probably let it dry out first. I don't think it would do too good just trying to burn it straight out of the flooded garden, you know. Yeah, but keeping it isolated, letting it dry out, and then burning it would probably be the best way to go about that.
And you also have to think about animals that are, the bears that are gonna come,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
coons,
yeah,
whatever.
because they'll come to that stuff.
Yes, they will.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, but you gotta do what you can. It's kind of like with the cross contamination, like that isn't necessarily reasonable for all situations to remove your shoes and your gloves and everything you're working with between every area you go to. But if you are able to do that, it's the best practice you can do. Anything else?